She was auctioned off while still bleeding from birth, a cruel reality faced by countless creatures in the livestock industry. The young mother, separated from her newborn, stood trembling as bidders raised their hands. But one rancher had different intentions when he placed the winning bid. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Texas sun scorched the town of Calico Ridge, burning away any softness in the air. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the dusty ground, distorting the horizon and making even the sturdiest men wipe sweat from their brows. The wooden buildings lining the main street seemed to wilt under the merciless glare, their paint peeling and fading like everything else in this forgotten corner of the West. Dust swirled in miniature cyclones as cattlemen, drifters, and local townsfolk pressed into the square. Their boots scraped against the hard-packed earth, creating a constant undercurrent of sound beneath their murmurs and calls. All eyes fixed on the makeshift wooden stage, where a barefoot, shackled girl knelt, trembling, her head bowed in a posture that spoke of both defeat and defiance. Her name was Emily Johnson, though not a soul had asked or cared to know it. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, her frame slight beneath the rags that barely covered her. The dress, if it could be called that, hung in tatters around her thin shoulders, stained dark with blood that hadn't yet dried. It clung to her body with the weight of humiliation, marking her as something less than human in the eyes of those who had come to bid. In her arms, a newborn whimpered softly, its tiny face red and wrinkled against the harsh light. The infant's cries were barely audible over the auctioneer's booming call, a man whose black vest gleamed with sweat as he gestured broadly to the crowd. His voice carried across the square, describing the young woman as if she were livestock, strong back, good teeth, childbearing hips, words that stripped away whatever dignity she might have clung to. Emily kept her eyes fixed on her baby, refusing to look at the sea of faces before her. The child was hours old at most, still wrapped in a scrap of bloodied cloth she'd torn from her own dress during the birth. She hadn't even had time to clean the infant properly before they dragged her to this platform. The heavy iron shackle around her ankle had rubbed her skin raw, but that pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. The crowd's attention shifted between the girl and the auctioneer, some men nudging each other and pointing, others calculating what use they might make of such a purchase. A few women stood at the edges, their expressions unreadable as they watched another of their sex being sold like cattle. "Who'll start the bidding?" the auctioneer called, his voice carrying over the square. "Two for the price of one, a young worker and a future hand for your property." The iron chain bit into Emily Johnson's ankle, leaving a raw ring of crimson as she huddled on the wooden platform. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, yet she clutched her newborn to her chest with fierce determination. The infant, Samuel, though she'd only whispered this name in the darkness of her thoughts, was her sole connection to humanity in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer bellowed, his black vest gleaming with sweat in the merciless Texas sun. His teeth flashed yellow as he grinned at the crowd gathered in Calico Ridge's dusty square. "What we have here is a rare opportunity indeed. 2 for 1, folks, young enough to mend and a babe to grow your legacy." The crowd erupted in coarse laughter. A man near the front spat tobacco juice that splattered inches from where Emily knelt. Another shouted something so vile that even the hardened cattlemen shifted uncomfortably. But discomfort didn't stop them from bidding. $20, called a voice from the back. 25, countered another. Emily pressed her cracked lips against her baby's forehead, inhaling his scent, memorizing the weight of him. She refused to let tears fall. Tears were weakness, and weakness invited worse treatment. Her dress, little more than tattered rags, clung to her body, still damp with birth blood that hadn't fully dried in the scorching heat. $30 for the pair. 35. Each number called out was another nail in her coffin of despair. The young mother stared beyond the crowd, fixing her gaze on the distant mountains. She'd heard stories of people escaping to those hills, finding freedom in their shadows. Now such dreams seemed as distant as the peaks themselves. $40 from the gentleman in the hat. The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement as the bidding climbed. Emily could feel the eyes on her, assessing, calculating, stripping away whatever dignity remained. Some looked at her with lust, others with cold practicality, measuring her worth for labor in fields or kitchens or bedrooms. $45. Samuel stirred against her breast, making a soft mewling sound. Emily shifted her body to shield him from view, turning slightly away from the leering faces. The price for their lives continued to rise like heat waves from the parched earth. Each bid was a stark reminder that she was still breathing, still bleeding, but already lost, a possession to be traded between men who saw her as nothing more than property with a heartbeat. The chain rattled as she adjusted her position, the sound like a death knell in her ears. Then, above the raucous noise, a calm voice shattered the chaos. 300, the man said, his tone hard as gravel, slicing through the crowd's amusement. All eyes turned to the edge of the square, where a tall man stood, face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His name was Michael Brown, a rancher with nothing flashy about him, but a jaw set like iron, and eyes that missed nothing. The crowd fell silent, their mockery evaporating into the hot Texas air. Emily Johnson clutched her newborn tighter to her chest, not daring to look up. She had learned that hope was dangerous, especially when bleeding and chained. "Did I hear $300? The auctioneer repeated, his earlier confidence wavering. The price was steep, far more than what most considered fair for a woman in her condition, with a mewling infant to boot. Michael stepped forward, dust rising around his worn boots. The rancher's presence commanded attention without effort. Several men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing him from trade dealings in Calico Ridge. He wasn't known for foolish purchases or wasteful spending. "You heard me," Michael confirmed, his voice carrying across the square. His gaze swept over Emily's trembling form, noting the blood staining her tattered dress, the raw marks where the iron chain bit into her ankle, and the protective way she cradled her child despite her obvious exhaustion. The auctioneer's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, folks, we've got ourselves a gentleman with deep pockets. Do I hear $350? The square remained silent. Most of the men had come to gawk or bid pennies for what they considered damaged goods. $300 could buy prime farmland or several healthy workers. No one raised a hand. A cattleman near the front spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "What's a man like you want with her kind, Brown? Thought you kept to yourself out there." Michael didn't answer, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. His stillness spoke volumes. He wasn't a man who explained himself to others. The rancher simply reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing a leather pouch that clinked with coins. Emily dared to lift her gaze then, meeting Michael's eyes for the briefest moment. What she saw wasn't lust or cruelty, but something unfamiliar, something that made her heart stutter with uncertainty. "Going once," the auctioneer called, glancing around the crowd. "Going twice." No one challenged the bid. In a town where most men spent their money on whiskey and cards, $300 was a fortune few could or would part with, especially for a woman still bleeding from childbirth. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed across the square. "Sold to Mr. Brown." The auctioneer's confident demeanor faltered as he stared down at Michael Brown from the makeshift platform. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not just from the merciless Texas sun, but from the unexpected bid that had silenced the raucous crowd. "Sir, you sure you heard right?" the auctioneer asked, his voice losing its earlier bombastic quality. 300 for the girl and the infant? His fingers nervously adjusted his black vest. Eyes darting between Michael and the crowd of cattlemen who had been jeering moments before. Michael didn't blink, his face partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. "Heard just fine," he replied, voice steady as bedrock. The rancher stood apart from the others, shoulders squared, nothing flashy about his appearance except for the quiet dignity he carried. "What's your aim with her, Brown?" a voice called out from the crowd. It belonged to Thomas Wilson, a local cattle driver known for his quick temper and quicker fists. "Seems a steep price for damaged goods." Laughter rippled through some of the onlookers, though it died quickly when Michael's gaze swept across them. The rancher stepped forward, each footfall deliberate as he approached the stage. His boots thudded against the wooden planks, the sound reverberating like thunder in the now hushed square. Emily Johnson flinched at his approach, instinctively curling her body around her whimpering newborn. "To give her a bed," Michael announced, his voice carrying across the square without him having to raise it. "Let her sleep." The simplicity of his answer seemed to confuse the gathered men more than any elaborate explanation could have. "Every soul deserves that much." His words fell heavy in the square, settling over the crowd like an unexpected rain. The auctioneer opened his mouth, then closed it again, finding no clever retort. Emily's eyes, which had been fixed on the dusty boards beneath her knees, lifted briefly to study the man who spoke of sleep as if it were a precious gift. Thomas Wilson spat into the dirt. "You gone soft in the head, Brown, or just soft in the heart?" Michael didn't acknowledge the taunt. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced the money, holding it out toward the auctioneer. 300, as agreed. No one stepped forward to top his bid. The men who had been eager to participate moments before now shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. Some drifted away from the square altogether, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere in Calico Ridge. The auctioneer looked around one final time, hoping for another bid, but finding none. With visible reluctance, he raised his gavel, the sound of it striking the block echoing with finality across the town square. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down with a finality that echoed through Calico Ridge's dusty square. "Sold!" he bellowed, pocketing his commission with greedy fingers. Just like that, Emily Johnson and her infant were property. Michael Brown's property. The tall rancher ascended the wooden steps, each footfall deliberate against the weathered planks. The crowd fell silent, watching with predatory curiosity. Emily clutched her newborn tighter to her chest, her body trembling despite her efforts to appear strong. When Michael reached for something at his belt, she flinched visibly, turning her shoulder to shield her child. But instead of a threat, he produced a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the harsh Texas sun. With methodical precision, he knelt before her, his movements slow, as if approaching a wounded animal. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the blade moved toward the thick iron restraint that had rubbed her ankle raw and bloody. "Hold still," he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. The knife slipped between metal and flesh with surprising gentleness, and with a quick twist, the lock gave way. The chain dropped to the platform with a final, hollow clank that seemed to mark the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Michael straightened, returning the knife to its sheath, and extended his weathered hand toward her. Emily did not take it. Her eyes, haunted by experiences no young woman should endure, searched his face for the cruelty she'd come to expect from men. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the dispersing crowd. The question hung between them, loaded with the weight of countless violations and broken promises. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but his gaze remained steady. "Sleep," he replied simply. "Then we'll talk like people." The unexpected answer momentarily disarmed her. Emily shifted her baby, Samuel, though she'd told no one his name, against her shoulder, wincing as she forced her battered body to stand without assistance. Blood still stained the ragged dress she wore, evidence of her recent childbirth that the auctioneer had used to drive down her price. "This way," Michael said, not reaching for her again, respecting the invisible barrier she maintained. Emily followed him down the steps and away from the makeshift auction stage, acutely aware of the stairs that followed them through town. Her bare feet left small, dusty prints beside his boot marks as they walked. She kept 3 careful paces behind him, close enough to follow, far enough to run if needed. Her child pressed close to her heart, the only thing in this world that was truly hers. The crowd watched them go. Emily Johnson, barefoot and blood-streaked, and Michael Brown, the stranger who had bought her only to offer her rest. No one followed. No one dared. The townsfolk of Calico Ridge merely stood, shifting uncomfortably in the dust, some averting their eyes while others stared openly at the peculiar sight of the rancher leading away his unusual purchase. Emily clutched her newborn son tightly against her chest as they walked, each step a testament to her determination. The Texas sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trail that led away from town. She did not speak, conserving what little strength remained in her body. Her feet, raw and blistered, pressed into the hard-packed earth with each step, but she refused to show weakness. The pain was old, familiar, a companion she had learned to endure long before today's auction. Coyotes howled in the distance as twilight descended, their cries echoing across the vast expanse of land that belonged to the rancher. Michael maintained a respectful distance as he led the way, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was still following. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his pace remained deliberately slow, accommodating her weakened state without drawing attention to it. "Not much further," he said, his voice low and steady against the evening breeze. It was the first thing either had spoken since leaving the square. The ranch sprawled before them, a modest main house, a barn, and several outbuildings dotting the landscape. But Michael did not lead her toward the house. Instead, he veered toward a small side cabin set apart from the other structures. It was simple but solid, with a small porch and a single window that glowed with warm light. When they reached the doorway, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. Emily hesitated, suspicion flaring in her exhausted eyes. The rancher made no move to rush her decision. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. One room with a stove, still warm from an earlier fire. A wooden cot with fresh sheets stood against one wall, a small table and chair near the stove. A basin of clean water sat waiting, steam still rising from its surface. "This is yours," Michael said, remaining in the doorway. "For as long as you need it." Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for the trap, the hidden expectation that must surely exist. Her arms tightened protectively around Samuel, who stirred but did not wake. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Michael Brown looked at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Because no one deserves what happened to you today. This is yours," Michael said quietly, gesturing to the modest cabin interior. Emily Johnson stepped inside cautiously, her body tense, expecting some cruel trick. Her eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for hidden dangers. The cabin was simple but clean, one room with wooden walls that still smelled of pine. To her astonishment, the cot was real, with a blanket folded neatly at its foot. Most surprising of all was a small wooden cradle positioned near the bed, ready for her infant son. "I don't understand," she whispered, still clutching her baby protectively against her chest. The child had finally fallen silent, exhausted from crying. Michael moved with deliberate slowness, keeping his distance as he crossed to the small iron stove. He struck a match and set a battered kettle to heat, the flame casting dancing shadows across the walls. From a cloth-covered basket, he produced a bowl of oatmeal and placed it carefully on the rough-hewn table. "You should eat something," he said, his voice low and even. "The milk's fresh from this morning. There's clean water in that pitcher." Emily remained standing, her back pressed against the doorframe. Her eyes never left the rancher as he moved about the cabin, arranging items with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to living alone. "I'll be back in the morning with more supplies," Michael explained, running a weathered hand along the edge of the table. "You need sleep. Your child needs a mother who isn't watching shadows." He turned toward the door, his tall frame blocking the last rays of evening light. Emily felt her heart racing, questions burning in her throat. This kindness made no sense in her world of chains and auction blocks. "Wait," she called, her voice stronger than she intended. When he paused, she gathered her courage. "If you touch me, I'll cut your throat." The words hung in the air between them. Michael Brown turned slightly, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. For a moment, Emily feared she had pushed too far, that the mask of kindness would finally slip. Instead, he nodded once. "That's fair." With that simple acknowledgement, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Emily heard no lock turning, no bar sliding into place to trap her, just the sound of boots retreating across packed earth. Alone now, she exhaled shakily, her legs finally giving way as she sank onto the edge of the cot. The baby stirred against her, and for the first time since the auction, Emily allowed herself to look, truly look, at her son's face in the gentle lamplight. The night settled over Calico Ridge with a chill that seeped through the cabin walls. Emily Johnson pulled the thin blanket tighter around herself, surprised by how the Texas heat could vanish so completely after sundown. Her body still ached from the auction block, from the birth, from the miles walked in bare feet across Michael's land. She reached for the glass bottle he had left, filled with fresh milk, and gently roused her sleeping infant. "Samuel." She had begun calling him that in her mind, though she hadn't spoken the name aloud, latched onto the bottle eagerly, his tiny fingers curling against the glass. As he fed, Emily's eyes never stopped scanning the shadows of the small room. From beneath the edge of the blanket, she withdrew a small knife she had discovered tucked between the mattress and frame. The handle was worn smooth, the blade still sharp enough. Without hesitation, she slid it under her pillow, close enough to grab if needed. Old habits formed in cruel places died hard. The cabin creaked and settled as the temperature dropped further. Emily strained her ears for any sound of approaching footsteps, for the telltale click of a lock being turned from the outside, for the heavy breathing of a man who had paid for what he wanted. But the night remained undisturbed. No boots on the porch steps, no shadow crossing the single window, no demands whispered through the door. Only silence answered her vigilance, a silence so complete it almost hurt her ears. After years of never being truly alone, never unwatched, Samuel finished his meal and drifted back to sleep, his breathing soft against her chest. Emily didn't allow herself to follow him into slumber. She kept watch until her eyelids grew heavy, until the moon crossed the sky and disappeared, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. When morning finally arrived, she noticed something new. Placed carefully on the edge of the wooden cradle was a handkerchief. It wasn't new. The edges were frayed from years of use, the fabric softened by countless washings. But it was meticulously clean. In each corner, bluebirds had been embroidered with careful stitches, their wings spread in flight. Emily reached for it cautiously, running her thumb over the delicate needlework. The rancher had entered while she slept, a thought that should have terrified her. Yet instead of taking, he had only given. Instead of demanding, he had only offered. The handkerchief lay in her palm, not as a claim or a threat, but as something she couldn't quite name, something that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. A gesture of humanity in a world that had shown her precious little. The morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Emily Johnson sat on the edge of the cot, her baby nestled against her chest, when a gentle knock broke the silence. Michael Brown entered, his tall frame ducking slightly beneath the doorway. In his weathered hands, he carried a glass bottle of milk and a small jar of mashed apples. His eyes moved to the handkerchief she'd placed carefully on the edge of the cradle. "My mother made that," he said, his voice soft but clear in the morning quiet. "For my baby sister." A shadow crossed his face as he added, "She didn't survive that winter." Emily studied the rancher's expression, searching for deception, but finding only the hard lines of old grief. The handkerchief's bluebird seemed to flutter in the shifting light. She ran her finger along the delicate embroidery, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected glimpse into his past. "Why give it to me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's gaze remained steady, his jaw set with the same determination she'd witnessed at the auction. "Because your child deserves better than chains and dirt." The simplicity of his answer made her throat tighten. He placed the small bundle beside the jar, patched baby clothes, worn but clean. Emily recognized the careful mending, stitches small and even. Someone had taken time with these garments, preparing them with attention that spoke of care rather than obligation. "I'll be back by dusk," he said, already turning toward the door. His boots made hollow sounds against the floorboards as he moved to leave. "Wait," Emily called, surprising herself with her boldness. The rancher paused, hand on the doorframe. "Why are you doing this?" The question that had burned inside her since he'd cut her chains finally escaped her lips. Michael turned slightly, the morning light catching half his face. "No one ever asked you how you wanted to live," he answered, his voice soft but carrying the weight of understanding. Emily clutched her baby closer, the words striking something deep within her. In all her years, through all her suffering, no one had ever considered her wishes, her desires, her hopes. She'd been property, not a person with dreams. "And what if I don't know?" she called after him as he stepped outside, the question raw and honest. Michael paused on the threshold, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then you start with sleep," he replied simply, before closing the door behind him. Emily sat motionless, her baby's soft breathing the only sound in the cabin. For the first time in longer than she could remember, something beyond fear stirred in her chest, the faintest flicker of possibility. Emily clutched the knife beneath her thigh as Michael Brown left, but his words echoed in the small cabin like ripples in still water. The wooden door creaked shut, and she found herself alone again with Samuel, who slept peacefully in the cradle nearby. "And what if I don't know?" she called after him, her voice catching slightly. The question had escaped her lips before she could stop it, a rare moment of vulnerability. Michael paused at the threshold, turning just enough for her to see the faint smile that softened his weathered face. "Then you start with sleep," he replied, his voice gentle as a summer breeze. The rancher's boots crunched against the gravel outside, growing fainter until silence enveloped the cabin once more. Emily's fingers remained wrapped around the knife handle, her knuckles white with tension. She had slept with a weapon every night since Samuel was born, not that it had protected her from much. The morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting golden patterns across the rough-hewn floorboards. Outside, a rooster crowed in the distance, and somewhere beyond that, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood carried on the Texas air. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Emily allowed herself to truly look at her surroundings. The cabin was modest but clean. A small stove in the corner still radiated warmth from breakfast. The cot where she sat had sheets that smelled of lye soap and sunshine, not fear and desperation. Samuel stirred in his cradle, tiny fingers reaching upward. Emily tucked the knife beneath her pillow and moved to lift her son. His weight against her chest anchored her to the present moment, away from the memories that threatened to drown her. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered against his downy head. "Can we trust him?" The baby made a soft cooing sound, his eyes, so much like her own, blinking up at her with innocent trust. Emily thought about Michael's steady gaze, how he never lingered too long or moved too suddenly, how he had cut the chain from her ankle instead of using it to lead her, how he spoke her name, Emily, with dignity, not as a command or a curse. Trust was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Yet here, in this stranger's cabin, something unfamiliar stirred within her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. For the first time in years, Emily sat on the cot, her baby near her heart, and closed her eyes. Not all the way, not yet, but just enough for the darkness to feel a little less cruel. Just enough to test what it might be like to rest without fear as her constant companion. Outside, a meadowlark sang its morning song, oblivious to the small miracle taking place within those four walls, a woman learning to breathe again. Days passed like slow-moving clouds across the Texas sky. Emily Johnson rarely ventured beyond the wooden walls of her cabin, except to fetch water from the well, or hang damp cloths on the line to dry in the unforgiving sun. Each morning, Michael Brown would arrive with breakfast, oatmeal, sometimes eggs, occasionally fresh milk. His footsteps a steady rhythm she began to recognize before he even knocked. "Morning, Miss Emily," he would say, placing the food on the small table before retreating, never lingering long enough to make her uncomfortable. He seemed to understand her need for space without her having to voice it. Trust, like seeds dropped in rough soil, began to take tentative root. Some mornings, Emily would find books left on the porch step, their pages worn but clean, pressed wildflowers marking certain passages. Other days, there might be a small blanket with stitched edges or a brief note about the weather or the crops. Never demands, never expectations, just quiet offerings. The baby, whom Emily had begun to call Samuel in her heart, though she hadn't spoken the name aloud, grew stronger with each passing day. His cries became more insistent, his tiny fists more determined. At night, when the ranch fell silent except for distant coyote calls, she would cradle him close and sing softly, old songs her mother had taught her, melodies from a life before chains and auction blocks. "You'll never know that life," she whispered to him one evening, tracing his perfect features with her fingertip. "You'll be free." Sometimes, when Michael was working the far fields, Emily would sit on the cabin steps, Samuel bundled against her chest, and watch the rancher move through his daily tasks. His strength was evident in every motion, yet there was a gentleness to him that contradicted the hard lines of his face. Once, when he caught her watching, he simply tipped his hat and continued his work. No smirk, no ownership in his gesture, just acknowledgement of her presence. At night, Emily still kept the knife beneath her pillow, but her grip on it had loosened. The trading post was still a place of whispers and sidelong glances when Michael took her to purchase supplies, but she found herself standing straighter, meeting those glances with quiet dignity rather than fear. One morning, as dawn broke over Calico Ridge, Emily realized she had slept through the entire night without waking once to check the door or window. Samuel had slumbered peacefully beside her, and for the first time since she could remember, her dreams had been empty of terror. The townsfolk of Calico Ridge had long memories and sharp tongues. When Emily Johnson ventured to the trading post for the first time, clutching Samuel close to her chest, the whispers began before she'd even crossed the threshold. Women pulled their children closer. Men averted their eyes or stared too long. "That's the girl from the auction," one woman hissed to another, loud enough for Emily to hear. "The one with the bastard child. Heard Brown bought her for his own purposes," came the reply, followed by knowing laughter. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards, counting each step as she approached the counter. The shopkeeper took her list without meeting her gaze, his fingers careful not to brush against hers as he accepted the paper. She'd learned to write her needs down. It was easier than speaking to those who saw her as something less than human. Michael stood nearby, examining a new bridle, seemingly oblivious to the whispers. But when he approached the counter to pay, his voice carried through the hushed store. "Is everything on Miss Emily's list accounted for?" The title struck her like a physical blow. Miss Emily. Not girl, or that one, or any of the crueler names she'd been called. She froze, the simple dignity of hearing her own name spoken with respect, washing over her like cool water. "That seems wrong," she murmured later as they loaded supplies into the wagon. Michael shrugged, adjusting the horse's reins. "What does? Calling me miss? I'm not—" "You're a woman with a name," he said simply, then walked off to secure the last of their purchases. Emily stood beside the wagon, Samuel sleeping against her shoulder, something quiet and unfamiliar blooming inside her chest. Not happiness, that was too bold a word for what she felt, but perhaps the first seedling of dignity, taking root in soil she'd thought barren. The feeling lasted 3 days. On the 4th evening, as Emily hung damp clothes to dry behind the cabin, the distant thunder of hooves broke the peaceful dusk. 4 riders approached from the east, dust billowing behind them like angry ghosts. She recognized them instantly. Men from the auction square. The one with the red beard had bid on her twice. The tall one had laughed the loudest when the auctioneer joked about her bleeding. Their faces had populated her nightmares for weeks after Michael brought her home. Emily snatched Samuel from his basket and pressed herself against the cabin wall, heart hammering against her ribs. The riders slowed as they approached the main house, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze, the same cruel sound that had accompanied her humiliation in the town square. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across Michael Brown's ranch. Emily Johnson was hanging laundry when she first heard the approaching hoofbeats. Her hands froze mid-motion, the damp cloth of Samuel's swaddling still pinched between her fingers. 4 riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as they approached. She recognized them immediately, men from the auction, their faces etched into her memory like scars. Emily snatched Samuel from his makeshift bed of blankets and darted behind the stable, heart hammering against her ribs. The riders pulled their horses to a stop in the yard, spitting tobacco and exchanging knowing glances. Michael emerged from the barn, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The shotgun in his hands wasn't pointed at anyone, but its presence spoke volumes. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing of the tension Emily could feel crackling in the air. "Evening," the lead rider called out, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. His beard was matted with dust, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a filthy hat. "We're here for what's ours." The rancher's response came evenly, each word measured. "This is private land." "She's stolen property," the man spat, leaning forward in his saddle. "A missing asset. Belongs to the Harmon estate by rights." The other men murmured in agreement, hands drifting toward their belts. Michael shifted his weight, boots planted firmly in the dirt. "I paid for her outright, at auction, in front of witnesses." "That don't matter none," another rider interjected. "Girl like that ain't meant for honest work. We know what you bought her for." Emily clutched Samuel tighter to her chest, feeling bile rise in her throat. The baby sensed her fear, his tiny body tensing against hers. "You misunderstand the situation," Michael replied, his tone hardening. "At this ranch, property doesn't breathe. That girl has lungs and a name." The lead rider's face darkened. "You gone soft in the head, Brown? She ain't nothing but—" "She's not for sale," Michael cut him off. "Not for trade, not for borrowing." He raised the shotgun slightly, just enough to make his point. "And you're trespassing." For several heartbeats, no one moved. The horses shifted nervously beneath their riders. Emily could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. 4 against 1, but that one was Michael Brown, whose reputation with a gun was well known throughout Calico Ridge. "This ain't over," the leader finally growled, yanking his horse around. "Some things ain't right to keep from their rightful owners." Michael didn't respond, standing motionless as the riders departed in a cloud of dust and curses. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did his shoulders relax slightly. For a moment, the world held its breath. The air grew thick with tension as Michael Brown stood his ground, shotgun steady in his weathered hands. The riders exchanged uneasy glances, weighing their options against the rancher's unwavering resolve. Finally, with curses muttered under their breath, they turned their horses and galloped away, leaving nothing but dust clouds and bitter promises to return. Emily Johnson watched from her hiding place behind the stable, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Samuel squirmed against her, sensing his mother's fear. She stepped out cautiously once the riders disappeared beyond the horizon, her knuckles white from clutching her baby so tightly. "You could have been shot," she said, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Her eyes scanned Michael's face, searching for signs of fear she couldn't find. "So could you," he replied simply, lowering the shotgun. No dramatics, just the plain truth hanging between them. Emily shifted Samuel to her other arm, her brow furrowed with worry. What if they come back, with more men? The question trembled on her lips, betraying the terror that still lived inside her. The memory of the auction block remained fresh. The chains, the humiliation, the blood still damp on her dress. Michael rested the shotgun against the fence post and looked directly at her. His gaze was steady as ever, like the North Star in a chaotic sky. "Then they'll remember what kind of man lives here," he said, his voice low but firm. "This land has rules. The first is that people aren't property." He paused, then added with unexpected gentleness, "Miss Emily, if you want to be called something else, let me know. Names matter here." The young woman blinked, surprised by the offer. In all her years, no one had ever asked her preference about anything, least of all her name. She shook her head slowly, bouncing Samuel gently as he began to fuss. "It was never the name I hated," she admitted, "just the way it was said." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if sharing a precious secret. "Emily Johnson." Michael nodded, accepting her full name without comment. Yet somehow the moment felt significant. The rancher picked up his shotgun and gestured toward the cabin. "Best get inside before dark," he said. "I'll keep watch tonight." As Emily walked back to her small sanctuary, she realized something had shifted between them. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she'd offered a piece of herself freely, her name, spoken with dignity, rather than shouted as a command. And Michael had received it with the same quiet respect he'd shown from the beginning. That night, something warmer than fear settled over the porch. Emily Johnson curled on her cot, one arm protectively wrapped around Samuel, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The cabin felt different somehow, less like a temporary shelter and more like something she dared not name. Sleep pressed down, heavy and insistent, and for once, she didn't fight it. But the dreams came anyway. They always did. Blood seeping between her legs, staining the auction platform. Laughter echoing from men whose faces blurred together in cruel uniformity. The memory of boots stomping near her head and the cold iron of chains against her ankle. In her nightmare, Samuel was being torn from her arms, his tiny wails drowned by the auctioneer's booming voice. She woke with a violent jerk, a strangled cry caught in her throat. The sudden movement disturbed Samuel, who began whimpering softly beside her. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she fought to separate dream from reality, her fingers instinctively searching for the knife beneath her pillow. Through the small cabin window, she noticed a glow. A single lamp burned in the darkness, its flame steady against the Texas night. Pulling aside the threadbare curtain, she saw Michael sitting on the porch steps, his coat pulled over his broad shoulders against the evening chill. His hat rested in his lap, and he stared out at the darkness, as if keeping watch. Emily hesitated, then gathered Samuel close to her chest. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she approached the door. When she pulled it open, the rancher didn't turn, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "Bad dream?" he asked softly, his voice carrying on the night air. She didn't answer. Words felt too heavy, too revealing. Instead, she stood in the doorway, Samuel quieting against her heartbeat. Michael reached beside him and lifted a tin mug, steam rising in delicate curls. He offered it without looking at her, giving her the dignity of privacy in her distress. The gesture, so small yet so profound, made something tighten in Emily's chest. She accepted the mug, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. The drink was herbal, warm, and comforting, nothing like the bitter water she'd been forced to drink before. It tasted of something she couldn't name, something that reminded her of a time before chains and auctions. The night air wrapped around them, neither warm nor cold, just present. Emily sipped slowly, standing at the edge of the porch, while Michael remained seated, both of them facing the vast darkness of the ranchland. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Samuel drifted back to sleep against her chest, his tiny breaths even and trusting. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Emily felt the weight of constant vigilance begin to lift, if only for a moment. Michael didn't pry into Emily's history, respecting the walls she'd built around her past. Those were her stories to keep or share. Instead, as they sat on the weathered porch steps, the night air carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, he made a simple declaration. "No one's gonna hurt you again, not while you're under this roof," he said, his voice low but firm. The lamplight caught the determined set of his jaw as he spoke. Emily Johnson looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Samuel slept peacefully against her chest, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of the handkerchief with the bluebird embroidery. "How can you promise that?" she whispered, her voice catching. The memory of chains and jeering faces still haunted her dreams, making promises seem like fragile things easily broken. Michael adjusted his position on the step, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "I don't promise," he replied simply. "I just keep watch." The rancher nodded toward the shotgun leaning against the cabin wall, close enough to reach but not threatening. It wasn't bravado in his voice, just the same steady certainty with which he approached everything, from mending fences to facing down riders who thought they could claim what wasn't theirs. Emily studied his profile, wondering how a stranger could offer what no one in her life ever had, safety without demands. The night breeze stirred her hair as she considered his words. "You can't stay awake forever," she said softly. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Don't need to, just long enough." He rose then, stretching his tall frame before returning to his chair, positioned near the cabin door. The wooden seat creaked under his weight as he settled in, hat resting in his lap. He didn't say more, didn't need to. Emily retreated inside, laying Samuel in his cradle before stretching out on her cot. The knife remained beneath her pillow. Old habits died hard, but her grip on it loosened as she listened to the rhythmic sounds of the night. Crickets chirped their evening songs, while an owl called from a distant tree. Through the window, she could see the steady glow of the lamp Michael had lit, its flame unwavering in the darkness. Like him, it remained, constant, reliable, asking nothing in return for its vigilance. For the first time in years, Emily slept through the night, her breathing deep and even. No nightmares jolted her awake, no phantom sounds sent her heart racing. Outside, the lamp burned steadily, a quiet sentinel in the dark, while Michael kept his silent watch until dawn painted the Texas sky with the promise of another day. Morning brought golden light over corn rows and fence posts, painting the Texas landscape in hues of amber and bronze. Emily Johnson wrapped Samuel in a simple cotton sling she had fashioned from one of Michael's old shirts. The baby, now growing plumper with each passing week, nestled against his mother's chest, his tiny fingers curling around the fabric. Emily stepped into the dirt yard, no longer hiding in shadows as she had during those first fearful weeks. The air carried the scent of earth and livestock, familiar now, rather than threatening. Her days had found rhythm, beginning with feeding the goats that bleated impatiently in their pen, and ending with fresh bread cooling on the wooden sill of her cabin window. "You've got away with animals," Michael observed one morning, watching as the most stubborn nanny goat ate calmly from her palm. "They know when someone means no harm." She nodded, understanding the unspoken parallel between herself and the creatures that had once shied from her touch. Trust was a slow-growing thing. Emily had learned to mend fences, her fingers growing calloused but skilled. She could keep the fire alive through the night, banking coals just so. The cabin that had once felt like a temporary shelter now bore small touches of her presence: wildflowers in a jar by the window, Samuel's clothes hanging neatly on a line she'd strung herself. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she even smiled, small secret smiles she kept for herself. Not the broad grins of the carefree, but quiet acknowledgments that pain was not the only thing life offered. Michael noticed. He saw how she stood straighter now, how her eyes no longer darted constantly to the horizon searching for threats. One afternoon, as she hauled water from the well, sweat dampening her collar, he approached. "You don't have to work," he said gently. The arrangement was for rest. Emily set down the bucket, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Dirt smudged her skin, but she didn't seem to mind. The rancher's concern was genuine, but she shook her head. "I don't want to sleep forever," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been months ago. Sleep was the beginning, not the end. Michael's weathered face softened. He understood what she couldn't fully articulate, that work gave purpose, that purpose gave dignity. And dignity was something that had been stolen from her long before the auction block. "Well then," he said, lifting the heavy bucket she'd been carrying, "at least let me help with this." For a moment, their hands touched on the handle, and neither pulled away. The summer heat pressed down on the ranch as Emily Johnson worked the soil near the stable, her back bent in concentration. Samuel slept peacefully in his sling, nestled against her chest. She had grown stronger over the months, her hands now calloused from honest work rather than chains. The weeds yielded to her hoe, one by one, as she cleared the earth with methodical precision. Michael approached, carrying 2 tin cups of water. He offered one to Emily, who straightened and accepted it gratefully. They stood in companionable silence, watching the wind ripple through the wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. "My sister Laura was 12 when a man took her east," Michael said suddenly, his voice low and even. "Promised her parents a better life for her, education, fine clothes." He took a long drink, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "I was supposed to go after her, but I waited too long. Thought she'd write first." His knuckles whitened around the cup. "When I finally found her, she was already gone, buried behind a boarding house with no name on her marker." Emily didn't reach for him, didn't offer empty words. The rancher's pain was a language she understood too well. Instead, she stood beside him, their shadows merging on the sun-baked ground. Samuel stirred against her, and Michael's gaze softened at the child's movement. "That's why you bought us," she said, not a question, but a realization. He nodded once. No one should disappear without a trace. 3 days later, Michael was repairing the barn roof when a rotten board gave way. Emily heard the crash from the cabin and ran to find him clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. A jagged gash ran from elbow to wrist. She guided him to the porch, her movements quick but gentle. With steady hands, she cleaned the wound with whiskey from his cabinet, then threaded a needle she'd sterilized in the flame. Samuel watched from his cradle, unusually quiet. "Hold still," she instructed, beginning to stitch the flesh together with neat, even movements. Her fingers, once too weak to hold a spoon, now worked with surgeon-like precision. Michael watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows. When she finished the final stitch and tied it off, her hand lingered over his arm, just above his heart. "I'm afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening crickets. "But not of you." The admission hung between them, fragile as morning mist. The rancher remained still, understanding the weight of those words from a woman who had every reason to fear all men. "That's more than I deserve," he finally said. "No," Emily replied, meeting his eyes. "It's exactly what you earned." Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she finished the last stitch on Michael's arm. The wound wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to scare them both. Her hand lingered over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his worn cotton shirt. The warmth of his skin radiated through the fabric, a reminder that he was alive, solid, real. "If I can't trust men," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening crickets outside, "I still want to trust you." The words hung between them, fragile as spider silk, but just as strong in their way. Michael Brown looked at her, his weathered face softening in the lamplight. Words formed and died in his throat, caught behind years of careful silence. He simply nodded, understanding the weight of what she'd offered. Emily Johnson stepped back, wiping her hands on a clean rag. Samuel cooed from his makeshift cradle, a sound that still made her heart clench with fierce love. "You should rest," she said, gathering the bloodied cloths and bowl of water. "The medicine might make you drowsy." "Thank you," Michael finally managed, the words rough around the edges. Later, as night draped itself over the ranch, Emily sat at the small table in her cabin, a stub of pencil between her fingers. Samuel slept peacefully beside her, his tiny chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm that had become her greatest comfort. The rancher had given her paper months ago, though she'd never used it until now. Her letters were uneven, but clear as she wrote 5 simple words on the scrap. She folded it carefully, like something precious, before walking through the darkness to the main house. Michael's supper plate sat waiting on the porch where she always left it. She tucked the note beneath the tin cup, her heart hammering, as if she'd committed some great act of courage or folly. Then she slipped away, back to her cabin, back to Samuel. In the soft glow of his oil lamp, Michael discovered the note as he cleared his plate. "Thank you for not giving up." He read the words once, twice, 3 times, feeling them sink into him like rain into parched earth. His fingers, calloused from years of ranch work, traced each letter with unexpected tenderness. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Something long frozen inside him, something that had crystallized when he'd failed to save Laura, began to thaw. The sensation was almost painful, like blood returning to numbed limbs. Outside, the Texas night stretched vast and star-filled over the ranch. Michael sat on his porch steps, the note a weight against his chest, watching the small light in Emily's cabin window until it finally went dark. The peace that had slowly settled over Michael Brown's ranch shattered one evening when hoofbeats announced an unwelcome visitor. A man in a fine gray coat dismounted with practiced elegance, his polished boots barely collecting dust as he strode toward the main house. Emily Johnson watched from the garden, her hands freezing mid-task as she recognized the cold authority in his posture. "I represent Mr. Hargrove's interests," the man announced, producing a rolled parchment from his coat. "This woman was purchased legally at auction. My employer has rights to reclaim his property." Michael stood on the porch, shoulders squared. "She isn't property." "The law disagrees," the man replied, unfurling the contract. "She was bought at auction, fair and square." Michael's jaw clenched, the muscles tightening visibly. "There's no fairness in that." The stranger's lips curled into a thin smile. "Then perhaps we should settle this as gentlemen. Tomorrow, noon, the main street." His challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Emily clutched the fence post, her knuckles white. "Michael, don't!" But the rancher had already nodded. "I'll be there." Word spread through Calico Ridge like wildfire. By midday, the dusty street had transformed into a theater of judgment. Townsfolk lined the boardwalks, some with pity in their eyes, others with cruel anticipation. Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, Samuel wrapped tightly against her chest, her heart hammering. The men faced each other, across 30 paces. Michael's weathered hand hovered near his holster, his eyes never leaving his opponent. The stranger in gray adjusted his gloves with theatrical precision. "Draw!" someone shouted. 2 shots cracked almost as one. The stranger staggered, a look of disbelief crossing his face as crimson bloomed across his chest. He crumpled to the dirt as Michael lowered his smoking pistol. That night, as if her body could no longer bear the strain, Emily collapsed with fever. Her skin burned like the Texas sun, her breathing shallow and labored. Michael carried her to his own bed, closer to the hearth's warmth. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, spooned broth between her cracked lips, and whispered reassurances when nightmares made her cry out. When Samuel wailed with hunger, Michael awkwardly prepared the bottle, cradling the infant against his shoulder as he had once seen Emily do. For 3 days and nights, he moved between mother and child, sleeping only in brief moments, slumped in a chair. When Emily finally opened her eyes, the fever broken, she found Michael beside her, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his strong arms. The rancher's face was stubbled and exhausted, but his eyes held steady relief. "You stayed," she whispered. "Always will," he answered simply. In that moment, Emily knew with bone-deep certainty what had once seemed impossible. She was not alone, not anymore.